Okay, are you guys ready for a BIOS update? Now this is long overdue. We're going to do a BIOS update. We're back to the Gigabyte TRX40 Designare motherboard. First of all, there's some things we need to cover that we need to go through from a historical perspective. This came up with Rick, who I've been waiting to hear from, and he's had some health problems, so I hope he's going to be all right. But he finally got back to me and said, Gil, I'm running the BIOS, it's okay, but I'm not running a configuration that's quite as involved as yours is. Which kind of brings us to the next point. This last BIOS we did, which we're going to take a look at from a historical perspective, I need to explain as we extrapolate this information, because as we go forward, this thing with the BIOS really matters. So I'm going to take you to a computer and give a better explanation. Let's go to the Gigabyte TRX40 Designare first. There's a few things that we need to talk about historically. So let's go to Gigabyte's website. We'll take a look at the BIOS updates, and then we're going to look at the computer of those updates, because there's an explanation of one of the file formats in terms of the version of the BIOS. This is extremely important because remember, there's a lot going on here with this machine. We have not only a motherboard BIOS that we have to concern ourselves with, but we have Thunderbolt 3 on here, which has two aspects, one of those being a firmware it has as well as a driver it has. So because of that integration, I want to point this out so as we go forward, it'll hopefully keep things simple. So let's look at Gigabyte's site first. And but by the way, all these links will be up in the description. And I want to thank you guys for joining us. My name's Gil Boyd. This is Builder Buy. Welcome. Okay, of the BIOSes that are listed, F1, F3, F4i, and F4q. The first thing you need to be aware of these BIOS updates, wherever you're at, and we are on the Gigabyte TRX40 Designare Revision 1. So you will have similar information that will be applicable to the Revision 2 motherboard, but your BIOS file names will be different. Okay, F1, F3, F4i, and Q. If you'll notice the lower case, that denotes a beta BIOS. Now we have what says F4i. I've got some explanation to do on that we'll get to in a minute. F4Q is where we're going. Wherever you're at on this tree of food chain, there was an F2 that we had. This order of BIOS updates is extremely important because some of this information, even though this is cumulative, it's not all inclusive with each BIOS. And that's what I want to point out, because those of you that are on a machine with Thunderbolt 4, you know what I'm talking about. But on this machine, we're only dealing with Thunderbolt 3. So whatever BIOS version you have, you want to step through each one of these. Now the next point, as you step through a BIOS, the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to blow all the settings out that you've got. So what you want to do, you need to go into your BIOS, document all those settings, just like what we talked about with the RAID. Everything we've done for the specificity has been for a reason, to keep this simple and to make it work. So as you document that information, we're going to have to go back and set it. The first thing that'll happen, each BIOS update will blow that information out to a default. Occasionally, sometime what we've seen in the past, a system might get hung on a BIOS update, so what you would need to do is go in and tell the system, okay, use the defaults. It would boot for whatever was hanging, it would reset something so it would go through the process, then you could go back in. Okay, what we need to do is we need to, after we've updated the BIOS, we need to power the machine down, because we don't want to be caught in some kind of a ghost boot. What I mean by that is if we have a BIOS update, and even if it was successful, there may still be something in memory. So what we want to do is power everything down to make sure that there is no power to the machine, so when we plug back in and when we energize, when we power back up, everything's clear and we're good to go. So first thing I want to do is show you this deal, or this issue with the F4i BIOS. So I'm going to show you the files, and I'm going to show you what's inside the files, and I think it'll be self-explanatory. Now I've got all these files on this particular hard drive, and we're going to look specifically at the F4i. Now this F4i, I'm going to hover over it, and down here on the bottom left of the screen, you'll see the file name. Shows the location, shows the BIOS, and it says F4i. Okay, the distinction and the purpose of that, the original F4i was a buggy BIOS. I don't like buggy BIOSes. I don't like being a guinea pig. There were a lot of people that went through some BIOSes because they were too quick to get on it. After all, it was put out, should be good. Well, remember, lowercase means beta. So just because it says it's going to work doesn't mean it's going to work. So a lot of people said, oh, my motherboard's been bricked. That was a real bummer. So I don't like being a guinea pig. So now that I've heard from Rick, he says he's good with it. We're going to try it. Some others of you have been asking about it, chomping at the bits. And because one of you had told me, and it looked like your system stepped back through 4 different BIOSes. I can understand going through 2 because you have a primary and a secondary BIOS. And I can possibly see maybe 3 BIOSes if one was being ghosted, meaning it was up in memory because you didn't power down, you didn't start from a cold boot. But to go through 4 BIOSes, that kind of leaves me questioning, has me wondering what happened. So one of our subscribers went ahead and updated, and some reason it jumped back, but he finally got it to where it was working. So I really think his issue was because he didn't power the machine down. Number 1. Number 2, it may have been because he didn't clear the BIOS. In other words, use the default settings, go through a boot loop, and then come back and do your custom settings. That could have been part of that. But the 4 I don't get. I could understand 3. So I want us to be very deliberate and clear on what we're getting ready to do. Now, another point I want to show you. Looking at these files, they're not all the same size. We go from 5.86 megabyte, 5.98, 5.99, and 6.01. And they are of different dates. I want to emphasize the point that, again, you need to step through the BIOSes because we don't know without an errata document that tells us everything. They only give us a few notes in the description, and so we kind of have to go with it. And because of that, remember, it's beta, so we want to be very particular. Now, the other thing I want to point out, because of going forward, we need to also look at the dates of these BIOS files as well as the date of the firmware update for the Thunderbolt 3 card. Now, because this has the Gigabyte Titan Ridge Thunderbolt version 1 card, the same information will apply for the version 2 card. So what we're going to do, let's take a look at the information on the Gigabyte Titan Ridge. Now the firmware update tool says here 326. Looking at the BIOS, we go from 925 to 412, 925 of 2020. The point being, this was 326-2020, so we are right in between F3 and F4i. The point being that we should be safe with the firmware update that we have updated. If you did that, you need to go ahead. Now, the reason I say that is if we had not applied that firmware and driver update, which was very specific and very finicky to that card, we could have problems, which would imply we need to pull Thunderbolt out. Because the dates line up with here we are, there we are, and there we are, and here's where we're going, we should be okay to leave that card in and update the firmware. So all this little stuff matters because we want to keep this simple and make it work. So now let's go back and look at the file, because this distinction of F4i. If you notice here, I've got an F4L, which is actually in the machine, and we'll see that when we get into the BIOS. But this F4i, if I open this folder and that says F4L, if there's any question what that file is, right here it says F4L. Confusing? Absolutely. That's not the way that's supposed to be done. Gigabyte didn't ask us. Rick had mentioned that, and I said, well, I'll get into it, but I don't want to confuse everybody. We want to keep clarity when the next BIOS update occurs. Well, this is that next BIOS update, so I'm explaining it to you, so I hope it clarified. So if you're more confused, I apologize. You know, like always, you guys have a question to ask, we'll do our best to answer. But this is all about keeping it simple, making it work. So that's the BIOS we've got. Okay, next step we've got to go to is I need to have that BIOS file in the root of a disk. Now, there's another aspect to these memory sticks that I'm going to bring up in another video. But what I'll mention here, this is a disk. It's a 32 gig. This is a Windows Media installation disk that's ready to go. The Windows Media installation tool formats that for FAT32. This particular disk is the one that I've been using for documents and stuff. This is exFAT. I prefer exFAT, but I have to deal with FAT32. The point being, whichever one of these I use, I need to put the BIOS file unzipped. I've had some people ask me, well, what do you do with the zipped file? You have to reach inside and extrapolate that one file, extract it, and put it on one of these disks, either in the root or put it in a folder. It's a lot simpler if it's in the root. What I'm going to be curious to find out and what I want to show you is both of these disks. We're going to reboot the machine. We'll be in the BIOS because of the 3 or 4 ways to update the BIOS. Keep it simple, make it work. That's the way I like to update it. We used to update the BIOS from within Windows, but then Gigabyte said, well, that application, you have to install this parent application. That's bloatware and that's problems for BSODs, and I don't like BSODs, so we don't update the BIOS within Windows on a Gigabyte motherboard until they solve that. But we used to until they made us start installing that bloatware. So the other way is if you want to do it from the computer as it boots, good luck with that. I prefer going into the BIOS because I like to see what's going on. Remember, there's two BIOS. We're going to do the primary. We'll leave the secondary as a backup. We have a problem, we can get back. So what I'm going to do is put both these in the machine. We're going to reboot, and then we'll see which disk we're looking at. Kind of like who's on first. Now they're going to pop up in Windows. I'm not going to show you that, and I don't think I need to show you these disks that I'm plugging in. Just know that one is FAT32 and one is exFAT. And when they pop up, we're going to reboot the computer and go into the BIOS. And we're going to update. So I hope all this explanation gives you some clarity. I hope it's not confusing. And that's another reason I like to hear the post. I like to have a speaker on the system so that when I hear post, then I know we're good to go. It's also going to be relevant in another video where we're going to talk about the Windows Media Installation Tool. But from the perspective of trying to install Windows faster, that's come at us from 3 different questions that we'll do in another video. Okay, BIOS. All right, I'm going to do the easy mode F2, and up here in the top left, you notice it says TRX40 Designare BIOS version F4, and I've been calling it I because that's what the compressed file is, but it's actually L, but I didn't want to get into it. Now I'm getting into it. We're going to update that. Now, we're going to have to reset everything that we've done, such as, if you'll notice, PCI Express first, which is not significant, but that is, that being PCI Express with 16_1 bifurcation, 4x4x4x4, that has to be set, or else we wouldn't be able to see our M.2 RAID 0, which is those 4 drives. So all that has to be redone. The RAID is still there and it's still intact, so don't sweat it. It's just that when we update the BIOS, all the information goes away because it's been wiped out in terms of the BIOS setting. When we reset the BIOS, voila. And we'll have to check. Everybody else is on auto. The above 4G decoding, we're going to get more into that later. Right now, it's set for off. I'll explain that in the next video better. Right now, we don't need it on. The other issue that's going to get changed is Thunderbolt configuration. We have those all set for 256. Those will be dropped back to probably, I think the default was 64. So we will increase the aperture size on the megabytes per port and the prefetch memory allocation per port. Otherwise, we get an error with anything with Thunderbolt. Okay, and I mentioned about the RAID configuration. That will probably be turned off. We'll have to turn it back on. So what we're going to do is go to QFlash, and if you look here on the bottom right here where it says F8, so we will press F8, and we are now going to go to the BIOS. So top left, TRX40 Designare, BIOS version F4L, which is extracted from the F4i file. And we have a BIOS date of 9/25/2020, and it says the size and the series. So the first thing we need to do, I don't need to save it, but I'll tell you right now, it's a good idea. If you don't have it, I do have it saved. So I'm going to update. I click on that, and I have to go find it on, that's interesting. On the disk that it sees, this is the exFAT disk. It's not seeing the FAT32 disk. I think that's interesting. Good information. I did not know that. I expected to see both disks. I expected to have to select the disk I was going to be on, which would be right there. So because the port I was plugged into, it sees both of them. And that's the distinction I wanted to make. So whether it's FAT32 or exFAT, this issue is going to come up again with the Windows Media installation because that has to be FAT32. I'll tell you why when we do that video. So I have in the root of that directory the file I want to go to and the file I've been to. So F4L is what we have. F4q is what we're going to go to. So while we're here, we'll just take the F4q, select it. By highlighting it, it dropped it down here in the bottom right. We're going to select, you notice when I hover over that button, it changes from blue to white. We're going to say OK. Are you sure you want to update the BIOS? No, but we're going to do it anyway. Yes, I'm sure. Affirmative. Now at this point, it's going to verify the BIOS. It'll go through the verification process to make sure the file's good. And if you'll notice down here on the bottom, also update the backup BIOS. If I put a check mark there, it would do that. I'm not going to do that. I only want to update the BIOS. So we're going to press start. Updating the BIOS. Now, as we update the BIOS, if I try to move the mouse around, you notice it gets kind of jerky and at some point it will freeze. When this is complete and we are at 7%, we should be able to reboot the computer, go through the bootstrap, and the thing should be working. The first thing I want to do once we get through the bootstrap is I'm going to power it off to make sure there is no power. After I've powered it off, then I'll come back into the BIOS, check the settings, which everything will be blown out, and I'll have to reset my BIOS settings. Then I should be able to go through another reboot process. Then we can go back into Windows, and everything should be hunky-dory. 28%, and we're only updating the primary BIOS, and it will show us up here in the top left, we're going from F4L, which is the compressed file on the Gigabyte website that says F4I. Gosh, that's confusing. And we're going up to F4L, which is the most current. Now this BIOS has been out for 3 months. This was put out in the 4th month. This is the 7th month. And to reiterate again, I just don't like being a guinea pig for a BIOS update because of the complexity and the nature of what can happen, especially after that last little batch. It's one thing to have one of these machines go bonkers. It's another thing to know why it went bonkers and how to fix it. And I feel for the folks that didn't follow procedures because they said, oh boy, Gigabyte released it, it's good to go, so I'm going to get it. And then they're like, you know, RFM, read that fantastic manual, but there is no errata document. We get 3 little comments about a description, but we need an errata document. That's my take on it. Updating BIOS now at 67%, only the primary. And when this task is complete, then we'll power down. I'm not taking this screen off until this process is complete. My concern is if anything happens, if anything goes bonkers. I want to see it, and I want you to know it. I want it documented. Updating BIOS now, 91%, 99%. Reboot in 4 seconds. 3, 2, 1. And when that reboots, I'll come back to me. So the system powers down. As soon as it comes back up, then we will go back into the BIOS, take a look at it, make sure everything's good and hunky-dory. Then we will power down from a cold boot, come back in, go to the BIOS, set our custom settings, then we go back into the operating system. And I'm just waiting for the post. It's interesting on these new machines, even though they run faster, they boot a whole lot slower. And for those that built a machine 10 years ago, you go build one of these now, you're going to say, what's wrong? Nothing. Patience. Patience, persistence, and perseverance. Okay, I've heard the boot. I'm back in, and we have a BIOS update. Let's look. So far, as we know, we have a successful BIOS boot. Now, we're on the original menu, which in the upper left shows F4q. Tells us nice things about our system. Says XMP is disabled. So I need to reset that, but what I want to do is power this down and come back in. It even says AMD Red Expert is off. Everything has been set back to the default. Occasionally in the past, when a machine came back up, if you had any issues with it, then what you wanted to do was go into the BIOS and tell it, reset those default settings, and it would clear and flush that information out. Then you could go back and do your custom settings. Otherwise, stuff would get confused. So we're at the point now, we need to power down. I'm going to pull the power, make sure it's completely drained. So when we come back up, we should be good to go. Procedure and the process. So all we need to do is a save and exit, F10, save configuration. And as soon as I hear the machine, then I'm going to hold my finger on the power. I'm waiting to hear the post because I want to make sure we're out of the BIOS. And it's dancing. There it is. So I'll hold down the switch, turn it off. It's off. Now to make sure, I'm going to pull power. I'm going to drain it by pressing the button again. That drains the capacitors on the power supply, drains the motherboard. Plug it back in, power back up. Now we're going to go back into the BIOS and set all of our settings. We've got another video we're going to do about this BIOS update that we've just done for some special settings that I know a lot of you are going to ask about. We will see that one setting when we get there, but because of the nature of it, it needs to be a separate video. Okay, as soon as I hear post, we'll go back in. Post, Waiting on the screen. It's interesting, I see it on the video switch before I see it on the computer screen. I'm back in the BIOS. We should be able to set our settings that we need. So from Tweaker, the first thing we'll do, memory set SPD Info. This is nice, tells us our memory is double-sided. I'm just verifying our specs. Tells us we have Corsair, which is correct. And I can look at each one of them and it'll give me the same information, but I'm just looking at the first one. So, good to go. One thing I will note, for those that wonder, even though this machine has a full RAM in it, if you notice, this is Hynix. That's not the good stuff. That's not the high-end stuff. That's not Micron, and that's not Samsung BDI. But we have 256 gigs of RAM in here, and it works. So for those that want to point that out, I know it. We've acknowledged it. So the next thing we're going to do is go to Settings. I guess the next thing we'll do, I'm going to do F2. This is the easiest way to do this. I'm going to enable XMP. So XMP is now enabled for DDR4 3200, and it will catch it on the reboot. Notice the boot sequence, it sees everything except what we want it to see. A Samsung flash drive, and then a SAN disk. We'll deal with that in a minute. So we'll go back to F2. We've set the XMP profile. It's just an easy way to do that. Platform power, nothing here we need to mess with. Escape, I/O ports, enter. PCI slot, the first slot is bifurcated. It has to be set manually or it won't work. And that happens to be where the M.2 Aorus quad card is at. The others are on auto, they're fine. We're going to go to Thunderbolt. Let's set that while we're here. And those will drop back to 128 and 32. Okay, we're going to set all those up to 256. It'll make me scroll through that. So I'll go page down to 256. Double click, enter. Double click on the next one, enter. Page down until I get to 256. Should have let me type it in, but it won't. Select 256, press enter. Now, both of those apertures are set. Memory allocation per port megabyte. And if you notice in the bottom left, reserved memory for Thunderbolt. Not enough memory might cause devices not working. And the prefetch memory allocation per port per megabyte. Reserved prefetch memory for Thunderbolt in the bottom left. Not enough prefetch memory might cause devices not to work. For VGA card support, it's recommended to set to 256 megabytes or higher. So we've set them both at 256 megabytes. We also have security level at no security. And Thunderbolt is enabled, which is the default. So we'll press escape. So we've done two things. Let's go to number 3, USB configuration. Nothing there we need to set. Escape. SATA configuration. SATA mode AHCI, NVMe RAID mode disabled. We're going to have to enable that. Chipset enabled, chipset port hot plug. We have to turn that back on. And it's not per port like it should be. It's all of them, which is kind of dumb. Anyway, escape that. And we're going to have to reboot the system before we'll see the menu that lets us get into RAID. The other setting, okay, right here. Under boot, CSM support. We have to disable that. If I turn that back on, you notice it's got LAN, storage, unified EFI, other PCI unified EFI, CSM support, we disable. And the other issue, now it sees a boot option for the Sabrent Rocket 4 2 terabyte. It sees a drive but not the RAID array yet. Fast boot is disabled. That was a default. And now we should be able to reboot, come back into the BIOS, and then see our RAID array. So we press F10 if I've got everything set, and I've done a lot. So hopefully if I know what I'm doing, number 1, PCI Express by 16_1 bifurcation. We've changed that from auto to 4x4x4x4. And for those that are wondering what's that about, well, when you have 4 drives that take up a 16-lane slot, each drive requires 4 PCI Express lanes. Hence, 4x4x4x4. Cool. So that's number 1. Number 2, we've changed the Thunderbolt apertures both to 256 gigs. Number 3, we've enabled NVMe RAID. Number 4, we've changed the SATA hot port plug to auto. And number 5, we have disabled CSM support. And the next thing we have to have is RAID Expert. It will pop back up as a menu that we can go in, then we'll be able to see our RAID. But we have to reboot first. So let's do that. So we have F10, we're going to say yes, reboot. And as soon as the system reboots, we'll go back into the BIOS. We should see our RAID menu, unless I forgot something. I'm trying to keep this tight. I'm moving kind of quick because we got something else we got to show you guys. And this has been long overdue. But like I said, I don't like being a guinea pig. Now that we have a better understanding of what's going on with the video card with Thunderbolt, and we've been able to separate those two because of that firmware update, that has really simplified life. It was almost like, as I've said before, a bus prioritization issue. Okay, I hear the post. It beeped. We'll get back into the BIOS. Yep. And we should be able to see RAID Expert. Back to the BIOS. Okay, we're back in the BIOS. We're in advanced mode. We'll go back to settings. Let's go to I/O ports. And there's our RAID Expert. So we can tab down or take the mouse right to it. Press enter. And controller management. View controller information. And we see one controller, 4 disks, 1 RAID array. Shows the version. Shows the firmware build time. I'll escape that. Rescan the disks. And we see, I can't tab up, so you'll just have to look at it. There's 4 drives, 0, 1, 2, and 3, each 2 terabytes. We have an array, array 1, RAID 0, 7.9 terabytes, normal, okay. So I can escape that. I can escape that. I don't need to look at array management or anything else, but I will tab over to boot, and I see right there, boot option number 3, Windows Boot Manager. So what we want to do is our memory sticks that we had that have the BIOS update files on them, I'm going to pull those so we're not monkeying with those anymore. And when we reboot again, we're not trying to look at them. We're only seeing one boot device, which is the RAID 0 array. One other setting we can do while we're here, for those that want to turn on TPM, let's take a look at that. We don't need it now. We'll want it later. So let's tab back over. Settings, miscellaneous, and right there, AMD CPU, FTPM for firmware TPM. We'll enable it. So we're good now for any testing we want to do with Windows 11. Good to go. So F10 to save that. And it shows the only thing we've modified, which is AMD CPU. But we've also removed these 2 disks so it won't be trying to figure out if it needs to boot from them. We're going to go straight to the RAID. We should be able to go into Windows. Keep our fingers crossed. Hopefully we have no problems and we should be done. Let's see. Save configuration, yes. Now the system's going to reboot. We should be good to go. Let's see what happens when we get into Windows. When we get there, I'll take you to that so we take one little quick tour and make sure everything's booting okay. I don't expect anything to go on with, here we go with the post. I don't expect there to be any issues with the devices based on the BIOS and everything we've set. Oh, I'm going to go back into the BIOS just for one reason, if it lets me. The system did another post. So I'm going to go back into the BIOS and take a look and see if there's anything funky going on. Let's take a look. I'll do the F2 for the quickie. Our XMP profile is being read for DDR4 3200. Back to F2. Shows our fans are all good. That MOS fan is the one that we've got to go back in and do something else about. That's running like a whirly bird. That's where the noise is at. If they'd use a bigger fan, that would help, but they size the fan according to the chip. Anyway, I digress. So I'm going to go back F2 to the advanced mode. I want to go over to the boot and look and see if we're ready to go. And it shows us boot option number 1, Windows Boot Manager. So everything should be fine. So we'll do F10. It's always a good idea to save the BIOS and exit. That's a habit we got into a long time ago. Sometimes you could go into a BIOS and if you didn't save what was there, something could get messed up. So we had a post, then we had another post. Okay, there's a post. I don't know if it was because I was hitting the keyboard to try to get into it or if it was doing it as a reset. Whenever you build one of these brand new, we don't know what CPU was on there to do the testing with. So a lot of times you'll get 2 or 3 of those posts where it does 2 or 3 resets as it tries to reconfigure the motherboard based on what it sees for RAM and based on what it sees for a processor. So those are just little things to be aware of. Okay, I see the donut for Windows. We're getting into Windows right now. Fantastic. So I think we have a successful boot. Let's see. The system is up. No, this is not Windows 11. We're still Windows 10. I'm going to go to Control Panel, Device Manager, and just take a quick look and see if anything there looks not appropriate. Our RAID array looks good, so I'm pleased with that. Display adapter is being seen correctly, an RTX 2080 Ti. And for those wondering, that's in there because it's only 2 slots wide. And storage controller, it sees the RAID correctly. And the next one would be the security devices, which is the TPM module 2.0. So I think so far so good. We look like we're set. So we've done the BIOS update. The next thing we need to do is going to be in this next video, and I'll show you real quick what that is. So I got to reboot. Now my advice also, once you've done a BIOS update like that, run the machine a little bit, do your stuff, whatever you're doing, but don't do anything new, different, or out of the ordinary, at least for 24 hours until you can verify everything's all right. Because if there's any kind of an anomaly, you'll know pretty quick. Okay, back in the BIOS. Okay, what I wanted to show you, okay, what we're going to do, we're in advanced mode of the BIOS. We're going to go to Settings, and I think this is an odd place for this, but nobody asked me. I/O ports, and if you notice the above 4G decoding, and right there, that little setting. That little setting on the Gigabyte TRX40 Designare has now been made available, and that's our next video. So we're going to talk about the resized bar support. I want to thank you guys for watching. We're on to the next video. We're out.